Chapter 5, Buck Learns a Job and a Lesson. Buck's ease did not last long. He and the other dogs were immediately taken to a mining camp where they were forced to become part of a noisy and dangerous life. There were hundreds of rough men, very few of them fair like Perrault and Francois, and all of them had whips and clubs. Their dogs were even worse. Buck had to be alert every moment. The husky dogs around him were unlike any town dogs he had known when he lived with Judge Miller. These brutes were constantly looking for a fight, and they gave no warning. Buck had never been a timid dog, but now he walked warily, not wanting to provoke these strong, angry animals. He and Curly had only a day to get used to their new neighbors before their two owners thrust them into another new experience. Francois brought out an arrangement of straps and buckles and fastened it onto Buck. Buck knew it was a harness, for the horses in Judge Miller's stable had worn such things. Francois then took the next step. He connected the harness by long straps and reins to a sled. "Now, Buck, mush, mush," commanded Francois, seated on the sled and waving his whip in the air. Buck looked back at the man in confusion. He saw that Francois was making forward motions with his body and pointing ahead while calling, "Mush, mush. Now, Buck, mush." Though Buck did not see the point of this activity, he understood that Francois wanted him to move ahead and pull the sled behind him. Buck did not like being used as a horse, but he knew that Francois always demanded strict obedience. So Buck set off, guided by a tug on the reins, to the left. Soon they were in a nearby forest. Francois hopped off the sled and let Buck rest while he chopped firewood. In spite of the added weight of the wood on the sled, Buck still pulled easily, and they were soon back in camp. As he unhitched the sled, Francois grinned approval at Buck. The next day, Francois hitched up the other dogs to the sled. They were lined up in a row, with Spitz leading in the lead and Dave nearest the sled. Then Francois buckled the harness around Buck and placed him in front of Dave. The other dogs were eager to start, and at Francois's call of mush, they leaped ahead. The quick start surprised Buck, and as he scrambled to keep up, he felt Dave nip his hindquarters as a punishment for not being ready. Francois waved his whip over their heads, but he only touched the dog with it if the dog lagged or slowed the entire team, or if the dog made a wrong turn. As the lead dog, Spitz, also helped discipline the team by throwing his weight to one side or the other, the jerk forced the other dogs into the direction he wanted. Buck pulled hard and concentrated hard on doing it right. When Francois finally called "Ho!" Buck was glad to stop. The unusual work tired him at first. He also had difficulty in coordinating with the other dogs. But by the end of the second day, he began to enjoy the pulling. It was another challenge, and Buck gained a sense of pride in meeting it and winning. That night after dinner, he felt a new comradeship with the dangerous and often treacherous huskies in the camp. Now he was the equal of them because he did the same work. Of course, Spitz and Dave were far more experienced, and Buck knew there would be much to learn. But he felt it would only be a matter of time before he was able and confident in front of the sled as those two. He wondered if Curly also felt this way about the new work. But when he looked for her, he saw that Curly, always friendly, was approaching a husky about half her size. Suddenly, without warning, the husky leaped in the air. There was a metallic clip of teeth and a leap back. Curly was left with her face ripped open from eye to jaw. This was a wolf's way to fight, a quick stripe and a leap back. Buck looked on in horror, but he heard Spitz laugh. All the dogs of the camp were roused. They formed a circle around the small husky and the wounded Curly, waiting intently and licking their chops. It was only later that Buck understood why. Curly bravely rushed her opponent, but he leaped in, struck again, and was out before she touched him. At the husky's next strike, Curly was knocked off her feet. She never regained them. As soon as she went down, the circle of huskies closed in for a mass attack. In a moment, Curly was dead. Buck had seen the whole incident, but almost could not believe that dogs would act so viciously toward one another. He heard Spitz laugh again. Then he believed what he had seen. He was surrounded by savages. There was no fair play. Once down on the ground, you were finished. Buck swore to himself that what had happened to Curly would never happen to him. In the back of his mind rang the sound of Spitz's cruel laughter, and Buck knew that he hated Spitz. Chapter 6. A Dog in a Nest. Perrault spent the next morning away from the camp trying to buy dogs. The loss of Curly could mean a delay in delivering the government messages. But Perrault was also so determined to keep on schedule, he returned after lunch with 2 more dogs. "A man is bringing another one to me later," he told Francois, who was examining the newcomers, Billy and Joe. These 2 huskies were brothers, though Buck would not have guessed it. They were very different in manner. Billy was much like Curly, friendly and always looking for approval, but Joe had a mouth that was twisted into a permanent snarl and eyes that glared angrily. Spitz immediately rushed forward to teach the brothers that he was the lead dog. He had no trouble beating up Billy. In fact, by whinnying and wagging his tail, Billy gave up before Spitz even touched him. Even so, Spitz bit him a few times in the flank before turning on Joe. Joe rose to his feet and faced Spitz. Spitz growled menacingly and circled Joe, but Joe kept whirling around and facing Spitz with blazing eyes and snarling lips. He feared Spitz, but he was ready to make a fight to the death. Spitz sensed this and dropped back, but to save face, he pretended that he had never intended to attack Joe and went after poor Billy again. The man who had promised another dog to Perrault brought him into camp before dinner. The dog was long and lean, with one eye and a face well scarred from fighting. "His name is Solex," the seller told Perrault. "It means angry one." Solex marched into their midst very slowly and deliberately. Spitz, who had risen when he smelled the stranger's approach, immediately sat down again. This Solex was not a dog to tangle with. But it was Buck's misfortune to tangle with Solex for the first time and the last time. Though Solex was like Dave in that he wanted only to be left to himself, he had one odd thing about him. He would not permit another dog to approach him on his blind side. Buck, not knowing this, happened to do so on the first night. In a flash, Solex whirled on Buck as he passed and slashed his shoulder down to the bone. Perrault, who had been told about Solex's oddity, interfered at once and prevented further trouble. But all the dogs took warning, and only Buck suffered through ignorance. With his shoulder paining him and the weather turning even more windy and cold than usual, Buck was uncomfortable and weary. Attracted by the glow of a candle in the tent where Perrault and Francois slept, Buck slid quietly under the flap into the warmth. But the 2 men set up a howl of curses at him and bombarded him with cooking pots until he ran back into the snow. So for an hour, Buck wandered about the camp, searching for a warm spot. Savage dogs tried to rush him, but he snarled and saw with satisfaction how they backed down. A heavy snow started falling. Buck was exhausted, and his shoulder throbbed painfully. Suddenly he had an idea. He would find his teammates and see where they were sleeping. To his astonishment, they had disappeared. With drooping tail and shivering body, he searched for them. Then, near his owner's tent, his forelegs broke through the crust of the snow, and he sank down. Something wiggled under his feet. Buck sprang back, bristling and snarling, but a friendly little yelp reassured him. When he investigated the hole, a whiff of warm air greeted him. There, curled up in the snow in a snug ball, lay Billy. Immediately, Buck selected a spot, and with much fuss and wasted effort, he managed to dig a hole for himself. He settled in, and soon the heat from his body filled the confined space. At last, in a nest of snow, Buck fell soundly and contentedly asleep.